Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The door that shouldn't break. It was a late morning in early spring when I first realized something was truly wrong in the quiet apartment I called home. I had just started a new job at a small ad agency in the city and was still adjusting to the long hours and mental exhaustion that came with it. My girlfriend, who was out of work at the time, usually stayed home with our cat while I trudged through work days and deadlines. We lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a 6-story building, nestled just off the city's main street. It wasn't the nicest place by any means, but it offered a kind of affordable charm. There was no security guard, only a keypad at the entrance that residents used to unlock the front door. Our hallway was quiet. Our neighbors kept to themselves, and next to us was a vacant studio unit that acted as a buffer from the usual city noise. On this particular day, I decided to call in sick after working an exhausting late night. Hoping to finally get some real rest, I turned off my alarm, curled up beside my girlfriend, and drifted off, grateful for a few hours of peace. That morning, the world outside our small apartment seemed to fade away into silence, only broken by the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional shifting of our cat. But around 10 a.m., a sudden forceful pounding erupted from our front door, jerking both of us out of our light sleep. At first, I assumed it was the maintenance man making a surprise visit, or maybe a delivery that didn't get properly logged. Half asleep and irritated, I groaned, rolled out of bed, and grabbed a shirt and some sweatpants before stumbling to the door. "Just a minute," I called out groggily, expecting someone to answer from the hallway, but as I pressed my eye to the peephole, I saw nothing. No one. The hallway was completely empty. That's when my brain, still foggy from sleep, began to process that something didn't feel quite right. I scanned the scene through the peephole again, then opened the door just a crack, while keeping the chain lock on. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A long, splintered crack had formed along the doorframe, as if someone had been trying to force their way in. Shards of wood littered the floor, and the casing around the door lock had started to separate. Just a few feet to the side, I noticed a large dent in the wall, positioned exactly where someone might brace themselves while kicking the door in. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a knock. Someone had been trying to break in. Not sneakily either, but with brutal force and determination. Whoever it was had waited for a moment when they assumed no one would be home or able to respond quickly. I immediately backed away from the door, locked it again, and braced it with our couch, which we shoved against the frame as a barrier. My girlfriend and I sat together in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The cat, sensing our tension, hid under the couch. We didn't speak much that morning. We just listened for more footsteps, for the sound of someone returning. But the hallway remained eerily quiet. That night, we didn't sleep well. The pounding kept replaying in my mind, the deliberate, repeated force against the door that now bore the scars of someone's malicious intent. For the next few weeks, we started placing the couch against the door every night before bed, pushing heavy furniture against the entrance, as if it would somehow stop whoever had tried to get in from ever trying again. I began coming home from work earlier, double-checking the lock, glancing down the hallway to make sure we weren't being watched. I reported it to our landlord, who assured me that the building had security cameras, but when I asked to see the footage from that morning, he said they'd mysteriously been offline. It felt like the world had shifted slightly off kilter, and our apartment no longer felt like home. There was a moment, a few days later, that still haunts me. I was standing in the hallway alone, just outside our door, when I turned to face the wall and imagined someone standing there, pressing their weight into it for leverage. I saw in my mind the angle, the stance, the moment of decision before impact. And then I imagined them listening, waiting, to hear a woman's voice from inside instead of mine. That thought, more than anything, made me feel sick. Because what if I hadn't been home that morning? What if it had been only my girlfriend, still asleep and vulnerable? The sheer unknown of the intruder's intention lingered in my thoughts like a dark shadow I couldn't shake. We moved out not long after. The idea of staying there, of sleeping in a place that had nearly been breached, while we were in the same room, became unbearable. I didn't feel safe. Even after we found a new apartment in a different neighborhood with better lighting and cameras that actually worked, I still found myself instinctively bracing the door with a chair or checking the peephole every time I heard a sound in the hallway. I developed a habit of bolting up in bed at the slightest creak, heart pounding, eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. That experience left a mark, not just on the wood of our old door, but on me. Even today, years later, I'll sometimes catch myself holding my breath as I approach my front door, waiting to see if something is out of place. I no longer live in a city. We've since moved to a quieter town with fewer people and far less foot traffic, but that incident made me realize just how fragile the illusion of safety can be. One morning can change everything. One moment when someone tries your door, not to knock but to take, to enter without consent, to cross a line that should never be crossed. That violation, the sound of boots on wood, the sharp crack of impact against the frame, that sound lives somewhere in my memory, playing like an old recording when I least expect it. The police never found out who it was. No witnesses came forward. No cameras caught a face. To this day, I don't know if it was random or if we were targeted. Maybe they assumed the apartment next to ours was vacant, as it had been for some time, and figured we were too. Or maybe they watched and waited. Maybe they knew. That's the kind of thought that lingers long after the couch has been pulled back from the door, after the paint's been patched, after the locks have been changed. It's not just about feeling unsafe. It's about never being able to know what might have happened if things had gone just a little differently. Now, whenever someone knocks unexpectedly, I pause. I hesitate. I walk quietly to the door and look first before saying anything. I check the corners, the walls, the hinges. Because once you've heard your door nearly break, once you've seen it bend and splinter under pressure, you never hear a knock the same way again. It doesn't sound like a greeting anymore. It sounds like a warning. And in the silence that follows, your mind fills in all the things that never got a chance to happen, but almost did. Story 2. The remote that crossed the line. It happened several years ago, in a quiet neighborhood, where the days passed slowly and the nights always seemed just a little too still. I had been home alone, as I often was, with my 4 small dogs curled up beside me. Each of them was a Chihuahua with its own unique personality, but all fiercely loyal and alert. I wasn't working due to several chronic health conditions, and my husband was at work that day, leaving me to rest and recover in our peaceful home. It had become a habit to keep the bedroom door locked whenever I was alone, not because I was expecting danger, but because it made me feel just a little safer, a small gesture of control over the unpredictable. That afternoon I had fallen into a deep, restful sleep, the kind that wraps around you so tight that you forget the world outside your dreams. Hours passed without interruption, until, without warning, I was jolted awake by a sudden, thunderous pounding on my locked bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It was aggressive, insistent, like someone trying to break in with their fists. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my husband home early trying to wake me. But when I glanced at the clock, it told me he wasn't due for several more hours, and then it hit me. He would have called my name, gently nudged the door, maybe even knocked in a familiar rhythm. This wasn't that. This was something else. The dogs began to bark in unison, their shrill yelps rising in panic. I could feel their tension vibrating off the bed as they lined up near the door, fur bristling, tiny bodies rigid. That's when it happened. Something slid under the door, something physical. A black object moved slowly across the floor, wedged between the carpet and the bottom of the door frame. It was my living room remote control. I blinked, confused. How could it be here? I had left it on the coffee table before going to sleep. For a brief moment I questioned my senses. Was I dreaming? Could I have imagined it? But I wasn't the only one seeing it. All 4 dogs were staring at the exact spot where it appeared, their gaze fixed and unblinking. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. I whispered to the dispatcher, my voice barely audible. explaining that someone might be inside my house. She stayed calm, asked me to stay on the line, and promised officers were en route. I listened intently, straining to hear any additional noises beyond the door, but there was nothing, just silence. The dispatcher informed me that officers were surrounding the house and walking the perimeter. She told me to remain where I was until I was told it was safe to come out. Eventually, the knock came from the other side, but this time it was a voice. A police officer. I opened the door, cautiously stepping into the hallway with my dogs still surrounding me. Everything looked normal. There was no one in the house. The coffee table was untouched, and the remote control, it was back where I had left it, exactly in the center of the table, neatly placed like it had never moved. The officers walked through the house room by room. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no open doors. It was as if nothing had happened. And yet, something had. They reassured me that the house was clear, that there had been no obvious signs of intrusion, but I could still feel the pounding in my chest. My dogs hadn't imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. That pounding on the door, those violent, urgent strikes had been real. And that remote, whether moved by something physical or something else entirely, had made its way from the living room to the locked bedroom door. I kept replaying it over and over in my mind. The cold quiet before the sound. The way the dogs had reacted in unison. The eerie feeling of being watched. Not by a person, but by something unseen. For days after, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the remote had been knocked under the door by one of the dogs earlier, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe the pounding was just a vivid dream, and I had confused it with reality. But the fear never left. I started sleeping with the lights on. I kept the bedroom door bolted even when my husband was home. The dogs remained on edge, barking at corners and shadows like they were expecting something, or someone to return. Even though nothing else ever happened after that, the atmosphere in the house changed. It became harder to relax, harder to trust what was real. I never told my husband the full extent of what happened that day. I didn't want to scare him, and part of me still felt embarrassed for how terrified I had been. But deep down, I knew that I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was that came to my door, it didn't want to be seen. It didn't knock in kindness. It pounded with force, then left a message in the form of something familiar, something out of place. It's one thing to hear a strange noise in the night. It's another to have something move across the boundary of safety, to breach the line between your space and whatever lurks outside of it. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door, if I had left it open, casually trusting the silence of a normal day. Would I have come face to face with something I couldn't explain? Or would it have slipped in quietly, without a sound, and left me questioning my own memories? The remote control became more than just a device for changing channels. It became a symbol, an echo of that moment when I realized I wasn't alone, even if I couldn't prove otherwise. I eventually replaced it with a newer model, but I never threw the old one away. I keep it in a drawer, buried beneath odds and ends, like a totem of what I still don't fully understand. To this day, I've had no further encounters. The house remains quiet, but every now and then, when the wind shifts or the night seems a little too calm, I'll catch myself looking toward the door, half expecting to hear that pounding again. I trust my instincts now, more than ever, and I trust my dogs, because they knew something I didn't. They saw something they couldn't explain but understood all the same. Whatever was on the other side of that door, whatever had the power to move objects, to terrify all of us in unison, wasn't just passing through, it was trying to be known. And then, it changed its mind. Story 3. The man who wouldn't let go. Some wounds don't bleed, they linger. They fester in the background of your life, buried under day-to-day responsibilities, only to resurface when you least expect them. That's how it was with him. My ex-boyfriend. A name I no longer speak aloud, a shadow I try not to acknowledge, yet whose presence I feel like a faint vibration beneath my skin. We met like many people do, casually without fanfare, and when it ended after 5 long years together, I assumed we'd both move on with time. I couldn't have known that he never would. What started as a breakup slowly transformed into a life-altering ordeal of being stalked, watched, and haunted by someone who once claimed to love me. At first, it was small things. A strange message from a friend telling me he'd reached out to them, asking how I was. Then I noticed he would show up in places I'd mentioned in passing on social media. I would talk about a new coffee shop I liked. And days later, there he'd be, standing quietly a few feet away, never speaking. I began to second-guess everything. Who I shared with, what I posted, who I trusted. My world, once open and full of possibilities, began to close in around me. I started looking over my shoulder every time I left my apartment. I stopped checking in online. But none of it made a difference. He was always a step ahead, as if he had memorized the rhythm of my life and could anticipate my every move. Eventually, I reached a breaking point and sought legal help. I was granted a lifetime restraining order after presenting texts, call logs, and personal testimony. The judge didn't hesitate. But restraining orders only work in theory, not always in practice. The papers said to stay away, but his eyes still lingered in crowds. His energy still clung to places I went. It's hard to explain what it feels like to know you're being watched, even when there's no one in sight. It's a weight in your chest, a tingling in your spine. And sometimes it's just a name that pops up in a place it shouldn't. Years passed, and yet his focus on me never wavered. In 2019, it happened again. Another reminder that I was still under his gaze. Items sent in the mail. Old letters I didn't remember writing that had somehow ended up online. People from my past asking me strange questions about things they shouldn't know. He hadn't moved on. He was still tethered to me in a way I didn't understand and never asked for. I tried to keep living. I kept my online presence minimal. I learned to compartmentalize, to smile while carrying the quiet burden of fear. I knew he watched from behind fake accounts. He never used his real name anymore. But patterns don't lie. The way he wrote, the things he remembered, it always gave him away. What made it worse was the uncertainty. I didn't know when he would escalate again. Some days it was just a message from a stranger who seemed to know too much. Other days, it was more direct. Comments left on public profiles, photos saved to Pinterest boards with eerily specific captions. It was the emotional equivalent of walking through a fog you can't escape. Most people think stalking is loud and obvious. It's not. It's subtle, psychological, a slow erosion of your peace. And for those of us who've lived through it, every shadow feels like a threat. Every knock on the door is a question. Is it him this time? The hardest part wasn't the fear. It was the mourning. Because for every ounce of energy I spent protecting myself from him, I was losing time, losing joy. Relationships became hard. Friendships strained. I couldn't bring new people into my life without vetting them like an investigator. I wasn't trying to be paranoid. It was survival. I had seen how easily people could be manipulated, how he could charm or deceive his way through cracks in the wall I built around myself. And the worst part, I had loved him once. That part of me hated the fear he left behind. It felt like a betrayal of everything we once shared. I used to write letters I never sent. Letters to him. Not to reconnect, but to unburden myself. To say all the things I didn't have the chance to say when it ended. Things like I forgive you, but I won't forget. Or you don't own me, no matter how tightly you hold on. I learned that sometimes closure isn't something you get from another person. Sometimes it's the choice to live in defiance of their obsession. To laugh. To love again. To walk through your city without constantly glancing over your shoulder. These small acts became my rebellion. They became my healing. And yet, part of me will always be looking for signs. That's the scar trauma leaves. Even now, if someone from my past randomly contacts me, I pause. I ask myself if he's behind it. If I post something vulnerable online, I wonder if it's an invitation to him. But I don't let that stop me anymore. I've earned the right to exist without shrinking, to speak my truth. And if he's still watching, then let him see this. I survived. I learned. I moved on. Not because he let me go, but because I chose to walk away. Forgiveness is a strange thing. I don't forgive him because he asked for it. He never did. I forgive him because I refuse to let him own even a piece of my heart. What he did shaped me. Yes, but it did not define me. I am more than a story of obsession. I am not a character in his delusion. I am not a ghost trapped in his version of our past. I am real. whole and I am free. And every day I live without fear is a day I claim back what he tried to steal. So this is for anyone who has ever been followed by someone who wouldn't let go, for those who've been haunted by an unwanted presence. Know that you are not alone. You know that fear can be survived. And know that even in the silence, even in the moments when no one believes your story, your truth still matters. Your safety matters. Your peace is worth fighting for. And sometimes, just surviving, just continuing to be yourself, is the most powerful resistance there is. Story 4. The Shadow in the Living Room. There are places that cling to you long after you've left them. Places that seem to breathe in your memories and exhale them back in unfamiliar shapes. I once lived in a house that was either haunted or cursed. Maybe both. I was just a child then, but what I experienced there shaped the way I see the world to this day. It was a modest home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. One of those places where time seemed to slow and the air always felt just a little too heavy. From the outside, the house looked normal, even charming in a weathered, old-fashioned kind of way. But from the moment we moved in, something felt off. As a kid, I didn't have the words for it. I just knew the house felt wrong. The strange part is that the house once belonged to a kind, well-mannered family who happened to be part of a small religious cult, Christian mystics, to be exact. They believed in things most people would scoff at: spiritual energies, communication with the dead, rituals to clear negative vibrations. As a child, I didn't understand much about any of that. All I knew was that the house felt alive, not in the cozy, welcoming sense, but in the way an old forest feels: deep, ancient, watchful. And it didn't take long before things began happening. Doors opening on their own, light bulbs burning out the moment they were switched on. The sense that something invisible was watching, especially when you were alone. I kept most of what I saw and felt to myself. My mother had enough on her plate, and I didn't want to add my fears to her burdens. I remember one particular summer afternoon when the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. It was midday, and sunlight was streaming through the windows, but it did nothing to ease the oppressive sensation creeping up my spine. My mother was outside gardening, lost in her own world of soil and plants, and I didn't dare call out to her. Instead, I decided to do what my grandfather once told me. He claimed that ghosts didn't like electricity, so I walked through the house turning on every single light, trying to banish whatever had taken hold of the atmosphere. But it didn't work. In fact, the more lights I turned on, the worse it felt. The house didn't brighten. It seemed to dull, as if the walls themselves were swallowing the light. Everything became slightly blurred, like I was peering through a thin fog. Then, as I crossed the dining room and stepped into the living room, I saw it. It was just there, standing on the wooden floor, unmoving. A black mass, no more than 3 feet tall, with no distinct features. It wasn't transparent or wispy like something from a movie. It was solid, dense, real. It looked like a shadow carved from darkness, shaped vaguely like a large cat or some other animal. It didn't move, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes. Panic overtook me. I turned on my heel and ran. In my desperation, I clipped the doorframe and stumbled off the porch, landing hard on the grass. For a few moments, I just lay there, staring up at the sky, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. When I finally stood, I walked over to my mother and watched her garden in silence, afraid to speak. I didn't tell her what I had seen. I knew we couldn't afford to move. And besides, how do you explain something like that? I didn't want to risk being dismissed or, worse, pitied. So I held the secret inside, letting it settle like dust in the corners of my mind. The weeks that followed were tense. I avoided the living room as much as I could. I never entered it alone, and I never turned my back to it. But nothing else happened, not directly at least. There were still strange sounds at night, the creak of footsteps when no one was walking, the static on the television, even when it was off. My dreams became more vivid and unsettling, filled with indistinct shapes and voices I couldn't quite remember upon waking. But I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined them as shadow. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe. That's how I survived those days, by clinging to rational maybes. Years passed, and we eventually moved away from that house. Life carried on. I grew up, found a job, lived in other places, but I never forgot the shadow. It stayed with me in the way some childhood fears do, not as a ghost story, but as a silent presence that hovers just beyond the edge of memory. I never talked about it, not to friends, not to family, not until recently. It took a strange twist of fate for me to return to that house. Many years later, a relative of mine, struggling with his own inner demons, had barricaded himself inside and was refusing to let anyone in. He was ranting about witches and curses, about unseen forces that had followed him into that house. And as I stood outside the familiar porch, listening to him speak, I felt something deep inside me stir. Because I believed him. Not the specifics perhaps, but the fear. The sense that the house had teeth and was waiting to bite. I stayed only briefly, long enough to make sure he was safe and that no one was harmed. But as I left, I felt the eyes again. Not human ones, something else. Something ancient and tired and angry. That night, I had vivid nightmares of shadows crawling through narrow hallways, of being watched from beneath floorboards, of voices whispering just behind my ear. And when I awoke, drenched in sweat and tangled in sheets, I knew something had followed me home, if not in body, then in memory. There are things we don't talk about, not because they didn't happen, but because saying them aloud gives them power. But sometimes, holding them in only feeds them more. So I'm telling this story now, not to scare anyone, but because I know someone out there has felt it too. The cold spot in the room, the breath on your neck when no one's there, the shadow that stands too still to be anything human. I don't pretend to know what it was I saw that day in the living room, but I know it wasn't a dream. It wasn't a flicker or a trick of the eye. It was real, and it saw me. So if you've ever walked into a room and felt your chest tighten, your stomach clench, and your eyes dart to the corners, trust that feeling. Don't dismiss it. Not everything that lives in a house can be seen. Not everything that watches you needs eyes. Some memories are older than the walls themselves, and some shadows are not cast by light. I learned that in a living room bathed in sunshine, where a shadow stood without a source, and nothing was ever quite the same again. Story 5. The stranger named David. When I moved away from my hometown in my junior year of high school, it felt like everything I knew had been wiped clean. We left suddenly, right as spring was waking up the world, and I was torn from the friendships I had spent years building. The new school I was forced into felt cold and unfamiliar. Everyone already had their cliques, their rhythms, and their inside jokes. I was an outsider in every possible way. Shy by nature, I didn't know how to insert myself into the conversation swirling around me. All I wanted was a friend, someone who knew me, even just a little, someone who could make this strange new place feel like it might eventually become home. It was around this time that I signed up for Facebook, hoping to keep in touch with the people I had left behind. A few days after joining, I received a friend request from a guy named David. I remembered him, vaguely. He wasn't exactly my friend, more like a friend of a friend. Jerry's friend, to be specific. Back in my hometown, Jerry would sometimes bring David along when we hung out in groups. David never really spoke to me directly. He was quiet, even aloof. I always got the sense he didn't really want to be there, and I don't think he ever said more than a few words to me. So when he sent me a friend request out of the blue, I was surprised, but I was also lonely, so I accepted. At first, everything seemed normal. We exchanged a few polite messages, and I learned that he was now in university and struggling to make friends, just like me. That little connection, our mutual loneliness, was enough to bridge the gap. We started talking more frequently. He was surprisingly open, telling me about how he hated his job at Pizza Hut, how he wasn't doing well in school, and how he had recently moved back in with his mom. I shared my own frustrations with starting over in a new place, my insecurities and my fears. Slowly, over weeks and months, we became close. He was always there to listen, to offer advice, to be the person I could lean on when I didn't have anyone else. When college applications rolled around, he helped me through every step. He even paid for one of my application fees using a Visa gift card. No personal info exchanged, no strings attached. I was touched, grateful. I genuinely thought of David as my best friend, even though we hadn't seen each other in person for years. And yet, every time I asked to meet up, he refused. He always had an excuse. He said he was embarrassed by how he looked, that the pictures on his profile were edited, that he didn't want to disappoint me. I told him I didn't care how he looked, that I just wanted to see my friend. But he grew distant instead. Worse, he started to turn mean. The kindness vanished. He started using things I had told him in confidence to make subtle jabs. He knew exactly what would hurt me. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside him. One day he told me I was worthless, that no one cared about me, and then he disappeared. I was crushed. But life moved on, as it always does. Months later, I was invited to a get-together with some old friends when I visited my hometown. And there, among the familiar faces, was David. He looked exactly like his pictures. He laughed and joked like nothing had ever happened. But he didn't acknowledge me, not even a glance. Confused and hurt, I confronted him. He stared at me blankly, genuinely puzzled, as if he didn't recognize me at all. I mentioned Facebook, our messages, everything we had shared. He looked stunned. He said he didn't even have a Facebook account, that he had used MySpace briefly, then switched to Tumblr. Jerry backed him up. They both insisted that someone must have been pretending to be him. My heart dropped into my stomach, because the person I had shared my life with, the one who knew everything about me, had never been him. I had been talking to a stranger for years. We opened his real Facebook together and found the fake one immediately. The imposter had used David's mother's maiden name instead of his real last name. Clever enough to avoid detection by close friends, the profile was full of pictures, some pulled from David's old MySpace, some from Tumblr, and others that David swore he had never seen before. There were photos taken at soccer games from odd angles, like someone watching from the stands, photos of places he had mentioned online, status updates that described things he had done, even things he had eaten. Whoever it was had been following him closely for a long time. The reality of it all settled over me like a cold fog. I had trusted this person. I had let them into my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams, and they had used someone else's identity to earn that trust. I was furious. Violated. We tried to contact the fake account, but it was deleted almost immediately after we sent a message. They vanished without a trace. We never found out who it was. We never got any answers. All I had left was the weight of betrayal and the hollow ache of a friendship that never really existed. And I wasn't the only one. A few of our mutual friends had been messaged by this fake David too, though not as deeply as I had. Months later, I got another shock. My mother called, asking why I'd created a second Facebook profile under her name. I hadn't, but the profile she found had my pictures, old ones, paired with my mother's first name as the new account's name, something only a few people would know. I felt sick. Whoever had done this wasn't done. Maybe it was the same person. Maybe it was someone new. Either way, it reminded me that the internet leaves doors open. It allows people to wear your face, mimic your voice, and speak your secrets without ever being seen. I reported the account, and I had taken down. But I still wonder if there were others out, for still were others while, but as someone I'll never meet. I've learned to be cautious, to protect my digital life the way you lock your doors at night. I've learned that not every friend request is harmless, that sometimes the person who says they understand you might only be wearing someone else's skin. But I also learned that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it hides in shadows. And in the end, what saved me was real connection, friends who listened, a mother who asked the right question, and the truth that couldn't stay buried forever. I may never know who pretended to be David, but I know who I am now. I know how to recognize the real from the false, and sometimes that's enough. Story 6. The hidden room beneath the kingdom. Some stories aren't meant to be told. That's what I used to believe, especially when they involve powerful companies with long shadows and deeper secrets. But then I saw too much. And when you witness something that changes your understanding of reality, silence becomes a prison. Years ago, I found myself drawn to an abandoned Disney project called Mowgli's Palace. It had been built and swiftly deserted in a shroud of mystery. No official statements, no explanations, just silence. But the silence was what made it so compelling. I began researching. What I found was so strange, so deeply buried, that I couldn't help but fall down the rabbit hole. At first it was easy to dismiss the whispers as urban legend. Secret underground rooms, hidden doorways, dark zones where things happened far from the eyes of the public. But the more I investigated, the more I realized the consistency of the rumors. Multiple people, janitors, former employees, even visitors, spoke of areas within the parks that didn't appear on any maps, places where costumes never came off, where doors opened to nothing but black. One former cast member, who I'll refer to as Snow White, told me what happens when a costumed employee dies mid-performance. The suit stays on. The body is simply moved to a bench or curb. Another character sits beside them, and they wait, smiling, waving, until the company's designated cleaner arrives to remove the corpse discreetly. That alone chilled me. But it was only the beginning. I soon connected with a former janitor who had worked in the so-called dark zones, exclusive, hidden areas within the park where executives and private members of the elite could escape the wholesome Disney image and indulge in behavior more in line with a private club than a family resort. He described apartments built into iconic attractions, hidden nightclubs above gift shops, lavish underground lounge reserved for top-tier Disney insiders. But what disturbed me most was the name he whispered near the end of our conversation. Room 0. I asked him to repeat it. He only said, "You've never heard of it. And you don't want to." But I did. My obsession led me to another man, a construction worker named Hammer, who sent me blueprints that should not have existed. They showed a large, unmarked area beneath one of the newer park expansions. A space simply labeled "Do Not Dig." It was buried under a stretch of concrete behind a supermarket facade. No plumbing, no electricity, just silence. He found a steel door leading into that space, but it was locked from the inside. Around that time, he began seeing strange figures in the crowds. People in gas masks, not modern ones, but old, cartoonish models shaped like Goofy and Mickey. At first he thought it was some experimental marketing thing, but then he saw them in areas close to guests, huddled together, watching. He called them the Gascots, a term other cast members had also quietly used. They never spoke, they never moved unless you weren't looking. And when he stared too long, they vanished behind walls, into corridors that shouldn't have been there. One day he approached an old employee named Ida. She had worked at the park since the 60s, and her voice trembled when he mentioned Room 0. She told him it had been a Cold War-era bomb shelter, designed to house thousands of guests during a nuclear event. Mickey-themed gas masks had been made to soothe frightened children. But when an alarm once mistakenly triggered during park hours, they ushered everyone underground. According to Ida, what followed was chaos. People screamed in the dark. The lights flickered and died, and when they finally opened the doors again, most of the staff had gone missing. Those who returned said it was better not to speak about what happened down there. The official story was false alarm, and the shelter was sealed under layers of concrete. But as Ida looked at Hammer, her voice shook when she said, "They're still down there." Shortly after sharing that story, she was found dead, officially listed as a fall in her home, but the walls were covered in chalk outlines of Mickey Mouse ears, drawn again and again. I began receiving strange packages. A Mickey keychain left on my car seat. A child's drawing of a Disney castle slipped into my mailbox. Once, I found a line of bottle caps arranged in the shape of Mickey's head on my apartment floor, even though I lived alone and kept my door locked. The lines between coincidence and design began to blur. I stopped sleeping. Every shadow stretched a little too long. Every knock on the door felt like an omen. I tried telling myself that this was just paranoia, that I had let the rumors get under my skin. But then I noticed something worse. My internet searches were being erased. Emails I sent to fellow researchers never arrived. Accounts I had saved were disappearing. Disney, it seemed, had longer arms than I ever imagined. I tried to go back to normal life, to forget what I had found. But the silence made it worse, because I knew deep down that something was buried beneath the parks. Not just concrete and history, but something alive, something old and wrong. A place built to protect people from disaster, but that became a disaster of its own. And those gascots, they weren't actors. They weren't animatronics. They were the ones who never came back. The ones still wearing their masks in the dark. They don't breathe anymore, but they watch, and they wait. To this day, I haven't returned to a Disney park. I can't. Even watching commercials sets my skin crawling. I hear the music, and I remember Ida's voice saying, "Shut the door, dear. You're letting out the cold." Every time I walk by a toy store, I half expect to see one of those masks. Goofy's grin warped by rubber and time, pressed against the glass. Most people will never know what hides beneath the happiest place on earth. But I do, and now you do too. So if you ever visit, and you feel a cold draft in a warm room, or see someone in a mask standing too still, don't follow, don't ask questions, just walk away, because some doors once opened, never fully close. Story 7. The Man at the Top of the Stairs. There are memories so strange, so deeply unsettling, that even decades later they remain untouched by time. One such memory has followed me since childhood, hiding behind everyday thoughts like a figure just outside the doorframe. It happened in 1990, in a beautiful Victorian flat in central London, one of those rare homes with tall ceilings, wooden floors, and an enormous garden tucked behind wrought iron fences. At the time, I was just 6 years old. My father travelled often for work, so the house was usually filled with women, my mother, grandmother, and older sister. Despite the quiet elegance of our home, I often found myself wandering alone, chasing games only I understood. One day, while my mother and grandmother were downstairs in the kitchen, I raced up the spiral staircase as part of some imaginary adventure. The upper floor was familiar, my parents' bedroom and the living room, with its ornate fireplace and thick rugs. It should have felt safe, but halfway up the stairs I froze. Something shifted in the air. A cold, prickling sensation climbed my spine and my legs locked beneath me. I couldn't explain why, but every fibre of my being screamed to turn around. I remember stopping on the landing, breathless, confused, and suddenly filled with dread. There was no sound, no movement, just a heavy stillness that wrapped around me like smoke. And then I saw him. Standing in front of the mirror-covered closet in my parents' room was my father, or at least, someone who looked exactly like him. He was adjusting his tie, calmly, like he did every morning before leaving for work. His reflection glinted in the mirrors, but something felt wrong, deeply wrong. He wasn't supposed to be home. I had watched him leave earlier that day. He was across the country for business, yet here he was smiling at me, motioning with a hand for me to come closer. The gesture was familiar, so familiar it almost worked, but my body refused to move. My feet were glued to the floor, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. Everything in me rebelled against the image in front of me. It looked like my father, sounded like him, moved like him, but I knew, somehow, that it wasn't him. I turned and bolted down the staircase, nearly tumbling headfirst in my panic. My mind was blank with fear, my only instinct to run, to get to my grandmother, to get to safety. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, surprised to see me in such a state, but I didn't speak. I simply wrapped my arms around the folds of her long dress and held on like I was drowning. I don't remember crying, but I remember shaking so hard I couldn't stand. My grandmother didn't press me. She didn't demand answers. She simply let me cling to her while she hummed a soft Irish tune she always used to sing when I couldn't sleep. Looking back, it was strange, out of character, even. She was usually stern and no nonsense, but that day, she just accepted my fear without question. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she'd seen things too, things she never spoke of. I never told her what I saw. I never told anyone, for that matter, not until years later. I buried the memory, tucked it away in a quiet part of my mind, though it never truly went away. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped into that room, if I had followed the gesture of that smiling stranger. Would I have found the room empty? Would I have seen myself in the mirror, or nothing at all? Would something have changed, something irreversible? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. What I do know is that what I saw that day was not a dream. It was not a trick of the light. It was something wearing my father's face. and that something was waiting for me. As the years passed, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a daydream. Maybe I had imagined it all. But no matter how many times I revisited the memory, the feeling of wrongness never faded. It remained sharp, like glass beneath the skin. Even now as an adult, when I visit old homes or walk up creaking staircases, I sometimes feel it again. That cold, silent watchfulness, that sense that something is just out of sight, mimicking, waiting. Not everything that wears a human face is human. That's what I've come to believe. Some things only borrow our features to lure us closer. My grandmother has since passed away. We were never particularly close after that, though I always wished I had told her what I saw. Maybe she would have understood. Maybe she could have helped me make sense of it. I wonder if, in her quiet way, she was protecting me that day. If her silence wasn't ignorance, but understanding. After all, she was often called a witch, not in a cruel way, but in that strange, respectful tone people use when they sense someone is different. She always seemed to know things before they happened. Maybe she knew this too. So I carry the memory with me. I don't fear it like I once did, but I respect it. I respect that some places, and some moments, bend reality just enough to let something else slip through. Whether it was a ghost, a doppelganger, or something far older, I'll never know. But I do know this. It was waiting for me to trust it. And when I didn't, it let me go. Whatever it was, I wasn't supposed to see it. But I did. And once you see something like that, it never truly leaves you. Story 8. The open door that shouldn't have been. It happened recently, barely a month ago, yet the chill it left in my bones still lingers as if it happened yesterday. I had been living in Mexico, trying to carve out a temporary escape after graduating from school. The city I settled in wasn't known for danger. In fact, it was full of friendly locals, foreign visitors, and peaceful neighborhoods with schools, cafes, and tree-lined streets. I stayed with my cousin in a small but cozy house near a quiet hotel and a familiar Starbucks. The house was tucked into a part of town where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. But what made that day terrifying wasn't what happened. It was what almost did. That morning I had planned to sleep in. I'd been staying up late watching Netflix, reading, studying. Around 11:30 a.m., I finally woke up to a still and quiet house. She had been home all morning, and I assumed she still was. I didn't check. I didn't feel I had to. It was just one of those slow, lazy mornings when you don't even consider the possibility of danger. I stayed in bed, tucked under a light blanket, with my laptop resting on my thighs and a streaming show playing softly in the background. About 30 minutes into my peaceful routine, I heard what I assumed to be construction or repairs. Loud, repeated pounding, like someone hammering a wall. It was noon, so the sound didn't feel entirely out of place. I thought maybe my aunt had let someone in for home repairs. The noises were loud but didn't alarm me. I had no reason to be suspicious. I figured someone was just fixing something in the front room. After all, my aunt was supposed to be just downstairs. That assumption, I realize now, was my first mistake. I glanced at my phone and opened Facebook Messenger to ask her what was going on, but she never replied. A few minutes passed. The hammering stopped. I could hear male voices talking in low, casual tones. It didn't sound like panic or violence, just conversation. That convinced me even more that it was just someone she had hired for some small work in the house. My door remained closed, and I remained undisturbed. I was still laying in bed, my back to the door, distracted by the screen in front of me, and then the door opened. Slowly, quietly. I turned my head casually, not thinking anything was wrong, until I saw him. A man, a stranger, standing in my doorway. He wasn't wearing a uniform or holding tools. He wasn't dressed like a worker at all. He looked normal, clean cut, with facial hair and a button-down shirt. The kind of guy you might pass on the street and never notice. His eyes met mine. Neither of us said anything. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply froze, then shut the door and walked back downstairs without a word. I lay there stunned. The image of him burned into my mind. My first thought was that he had mistakenly opened the wrong door while trying to access the patio. But something in his face told me it wasn't a mistake. My heart was beginning to race. I stood slowly, listening for any more sounds, any more footsteps. Then I heard it. The front door slamming shut, loud and final. I moved cautiously to the top of the staircase and called out for my aunt. There was no reply. A deep sense of unease began to spread through me. I descended the stairs, unsure of what I was about to find, and then I saw her, my aunt, rushing through the front door with a look of pure panic on her face. She had just returned from the store. She hadn't been home at all. Her voice shook as she told me what had happened. When she left the house earlier, she'd forgotten to lock the outer iron door, a small detail, easily overlooked. But that mistake made it effortless for two strangers to break through the inner door. She said that, as she was returning from the store, she spotted two men walking away from the house and getting into a nearby car. When she stepped inside, she immediately noticed the TV was missing. It had been stolen right out of the living room, silently, while I had been upstairs. She hadn't even realized I was home until I came down the stairs. That's when the fear truly set in, for both of us. She explained that someone had rung the doorbell just before she left. When she looked out, there was no one there. We both believed that was their test, checking if anyone was home. And when they thought the house was empty, they made their move. But what they didn't expect was me. A girl lying in bed, unarmed, unprepared and unaware. When the man opened my bedroom door and saw me, I believe he was caught off guard. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not a young woman alone. That's why he left so quickly. But had the situation been different, had he been bolder, who knows what could have happened? The police arrived within the hour. They asked questions, examined the door, and explained the obvious. We had been lucky. Because in situations like this, the crimes don't always end with theft. There are darker possibilities that many girls in my position haven't escaped from. The officer said I could have been kidnapped or worse. That sentence repeated in my head long after they left. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow felt like it might move. My aunt stayed up with me, and we kept all the lights on. The next day we replaced the locks and installed additional security. But it's hard to secure peace of mind once it's been broken. I keep thinking about how ordinary the man looked. About how the scariest people in the world aren't the monsters we imagine in movies. They're the ones who blend in. The ones who smile politely in line. The ones who walk quietly up your stairs while you're unaware. I don't know what he planned to do. I don't know if he left because he got spooked or because he changed his mind. But I do know I will never leave my door unlocked again. And I will never again assume that safety is the same as silence. Sometimes the most dangerous things don't make a sound until it's too late. Story 9. The fog that followed. It was the kind of night that made even seasoned truck drivers uneasy. The road wrapped in a thick, choking fog, the sky endlessly dark, and the rain falling in slow, heavy sheets. My name is Jake, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over a decade. I've driven through deserts and snowstorms, mountain passes and midnight highways, but nothing prepared me for the night I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. The route was familiar, a lonely stretch of road that we truckers often used to shave hours off longer journeys. It was efficient, but quiet. Too quiet, and that silence felt unnatural. That night, the fog was denser than I'd ever seen it. My headlights barely cut through a few feet ahead, and the raindrops tapped softly against the windshield in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. There was something wrong about the atmosphere, like the world had been muffled, like I was driving through a dream that wanted to become a nightmare. Other drivers on the CB had warned about the stretch, stories of abandoned cars on the shoulder, static-filled radios, and truckers who simply stopped answering. I used to laugh off those rumors, but laughter dies quickly when you're alone with your thoughts and surrounded by endless fog. It was then, through the mist, that I saw him. A man, or something shaped like a man, standing still at the side of the road. I slowed the truck as I approached, unsure if he needed help. As the high beams lit his figure, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. His skin was impossibly pale, almost bluish, and the fog seemed to cling to him like a shroud. His mouth hung open in a grotesque expression, too wide, too unnatural. But his eyes, black, bottomless, soulless, were what truly froze me. They didn't reflect light. They absorbed it. I wanted to help. I truly did. But my instincts screamed to keep driving. I let the truck roll forward slowly, unsure whether to stop or flee. Then, just before I passed him, the figure twitched. Not a flinch, not a startle, just a single, jerky movement, like a puppet cut from its strings. And then he smiled. That was the worst part. His lips curled upward into something that resembled a smile, but it stretched too far, as if his face wasn't made to do it. I slammed the gas pedal and didn't look back. My heart pounded in my chest like a drumbeat as the fog thickened behind me, trying to reclaim what I had escaped. I reached for my CB to warn others, but there was nothing. Not static, not silence, nothing. It was as if the entire frequency had been swallowed by the road. I kept driving, the fog unrelenting, until finally, after what felt like hours, a parking lot to Topeka like a beacon in the night. It was a lonely, dimly lit lot behind a closed diner. I pulled in, shaking, and turned off the engine. The rain slowed to a mist, and the fog pressed itself against the windows of my cab. I closed the curtains, locked the doors, and tried to breathe. I told myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination born from too many miles and too little sleep, but I didn't believe it. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his smile. I saw those eyes. At some point I must have dozed off, because I awoke to a sense of dread so thick I could taste it. My body was frozen, like something had pressed a weight onto my chest. I opened the curtains cautiously, and there they were. Not just one figure, but three. Standing still in the mist, barely lit by the flickering lights of the parking lot. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and their mouths opened in unison, wide and unnatural. A deep growl echoed across the asphalt, low and vibrating, not like a sound but a sensation that crawled beneath my skin. I turned the key, desperate for the engine to roar to life. For a moment it didn't. For a heartbeat, I thought I was trapped. But then the truck started with a shudder, and I floored it, tires screeching against the wet concrete as I pulled away. I didn't care about traffic laws or safety. I needed to be gone. I needed light, people, noise, anything but the emptiness I had left behind. As the fog receded and the glow of distant city lights emerged on the horizon, I dared to glance into the side mirror, and what I saw still haunts me. They were running. Their movements were broken, twitchy like puppets on tangled strings, but they were fast, too fast. Only when I crossed the threshold of the city did they stop. As if bound by some invisible line, they halted at the edge, standing motionless as the fog rolled around them. Their black eyes stared after me, and I realized they weren't chasing. They were watching, waiting. I pulled into a well-lit rest stop, heart pounding, and tried to contact other drivers. Finally, the radio crackled to life. "You okay, driver?" a voice said. I choked out what had happened. There was a pause on the other end. Then a slow, quiet reply. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." The radio filled with voices, truckers trading similar stories. Each one had encountered them, described in different ways, but always the same eyes, the same smile, the same void. Some believed they were spirits. Others called them entities. A few even claimed they were government experiments gone wrong. But no one had answers, only warnings. They came when you were alone, when you were vulnerable, when the world was quiet enough for them to slip through. And worst of all, the road always brought you back to them, like a loop, a trap disguised as a shortcut. I've since avoided that stretch of highway. I take longer routes now, ones filled with people, with streetlights and gas stations and traffic. But even then, sometimes, in the distance I think I see them. Just a shadow too still, a figure too pale. I haven't slept properly in weeks. And now every time I drive at night and fog begins to creep along the edges of the road, I check my mirrors more often. I leave the radio on, even if no one's talking. I whisper to myself just to break the silence, because I know that if it ever gets too quiet again, they'll be back. Story 10. The woman in the motel window. There's something uniquely unsettling about motels. Unlike hotels, they don't try to impress you. They're not built for luxury or charm. They're built for sleep and silence and people passing through. I had been traveling across the country after a difficult breakup, trying to clear my head. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a solo road trip through small towns and wide open highways. By the third week, fatigue had taken its toll. I pulled into a quiet, roadside motel just after sundown. A faded neon sign Psychovetter Bandage like a warning no one bothered to read. The clerk was polite but distracted, handing me a key with barely a glance. Room 12, second floor, facing the woods. I carried my duffel bag up a narrow metal staircase, the steps creaking beneath my weight. The hallway was lined with old carpet and buzzing fluorescent lights, casting a sickly yellow glow. My room was basic. A bed, a desk, a television bolted to the wall, and a window that looked out onto a row of trees. I pulled the curtains back and peered outside. The woods seemed unusually still, like they were holding their breath, but I shook it off, chalking it up to road weariness. I unpacked slowly, took a lukewarm shower, and climbed into bed with the television playing softly in the background. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to a strange sensation, like being watched. Not paranoia, not fear exactly, but a deep, animal sense that someone was very close. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and looked toward the window. And that's when I saw her, a woman, standing outside in the darkness, just beyond the glass. She wasn't moving, just staring into the room with a vacant, unreadable expression. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like ink dropped in water. Her hair hung wet around her face, and her skin was impossibly pale, almost grey. I couldn't see her mouth clearly, but it looked like it was moving slightly, as if whispering something just out of earshot. I froze, caught in a wave of disbelief. Was she in trouble? Did she need help? My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Perhaps she was a guest from another room, locked out, waiting for assistance. But even as I reached for my phone, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering, just slightly, as if the air itself held her in place. I blinked, and in that moment, she was gone. Not walked away, gone. As though she had never been there. I sprang to my feet and yanked open the curtains, heart pounding. The woods were empty, the path beneath the window untouched. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined her face. Every creak of the walls, every groan of the wind sent my heart into overdrive. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Stress, exhaustion, the imagination playing tricks on a tired mind. I checked out early, trying to sound casual as I handed back the key. But something in the clerk's face shifted when I mentioned my room. He hesitated, then nodded slowly and said, "You're not the first." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I asked him what he meant, but he just waved it off. "Some folks think they see things out there," he said. "It's the woods. They play tricks on your eyes." I drove for hours that day, trying to leave the memory behind. But it followed me, not just in thought, but in presence. I began noticing things, reflections in store windows that didn't match reality, a woman's shape in my rearview mirror, only for it to vanish when I turned around. The sense of being watched whenever I stopped for gas or food. I started sleeping in my car instead of motels, too afraid to face another window. But the dreams found me there too. Always the same woman, always whispering things I couldn't understand. Her voice was soft, almost mournful, like she was asking for something she had lost. I eventually returned home, thinking that distance would sever the connection. But it didn't. A week later, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open, though I never opened it. The curtains fluttered gently in the breeze, and just beyond the frame, I thought I saw her again, only for a moment, and then she was gone. I don't know what she wants. I don't know why she chose me, but something about that motel room changed me. Maybe I saw her because I was vulnerable, emotionally and physically. Maybe she's drawn to that weakness, feeding on it like a wound that won't heal. I've started researching the motel. Local records, online forums, old newspaper clippings. I found one article, dated almost 30 years ago, about a woman who disappeared from room 12 under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Elise. No signs of forced entry, no suspects, just vanished into thin air. Her photograph was grainy, scanned from a print newspaper, but it was her. The woman in the window. The same hollow eyes, the same dripping hair. I contacted the motel. They didn't return my calls. Eventually, I learned that the motel had been shut down. A fire had gutted part of it not long after I left, and no one had rebuilt it. It now sits abandoned, its windows broken, its sign dark. Still, I dream of her. And when I wake, sometimes the curtains are swaying even though the air is still. Sometimes I hear her voice, just at the edge of waking, whispering a name I've never known. I don't believe she wants to hurt me, but I do believe she wants something. Perhaps recognition, perhaps release, or perhaps just to be seen. The dead, I've come to believe, linger not because they must, but because they've been forgotten. And once you see them, really see them, you carry a part of them with you. A tether, invisible and unbreakable. So now I sleep with the lights on. I keep salt by the window and old folk charms tucked beneath my pillow. It sounds ridiculous, I know. But when something looks at you through glass from the other side of reason, you stop caring what's rational. You start doing whatever keeps you safe. And maybe, just maybe, you whisper back, because you're too afraid of what will happen if you don't. She hasn't come into the room yet, but I feel her getting closer. Every night, a little nearer to the edge. And when she finally steps through, I hope I'm strong enough to face whatever she's been trying to show me all along.